Hi again all, same t-shirt, different background, different slides. Just going to talk for a few minutes about instructional models. This is part of your repertoire as a teacher. Instructional sounds kind of weird because it sounds very didactic, a bit like what I'm doing now, telling, but it's basically about the kind of experiences that you're planning for students. One of the readings is about the 5Es model, which is one of the instructional models that we're about to talk about, but there's a few. And as I say, don't pick the one true one, pick as many as you can, build your repertoire, make professional judgments between them. So this happens a lot, and I probably commented on it before. I talk about stuff and then the slide comes up, so we'll keep going on with that. But basically we'll talk about three different models. You'll see some similarities and some differences, and that's kind of part of the point. As we know, if you know how to use if you know how to just use Windows or just use Mac, you can be quite skilled. If you know how to use both, plus Linux or Unix, plus BSD, plus OpenB, plus, if you know how to use a number of operating systems, you are more computer savvy and better able to pick up a new one quickly than if you know one. Or if you know multiple languages. Somewhat shamefully, I really only know English, very small smattering of Pidgin, a word here and there in Spanish or French or whatever, but certainly couldn't hold a conversation. But if you do know more than one language, you're better set up to learn a third, a fourth, and so on, because you've got some of the features of language in your brain. And it's the same with these. If you just only know one, you're kind of stuck. But if you know two, then you're ready to learn 3, 4, 5, etc., and have a number of options. So these are the kinds of skills that we want students to be able to do in science. So these are the skills of learning science and teaching science and doing science. So observing, communicating, classifying, measuring, relating, being able to talk about where something is relative to something else and when something is relative to something else, being able to make predictions, being able to make inferences and implications, controlling variables, so the whole dependent, independent, controlled variables, etc., making an operational definition of something, so defining something for our purposes at a particular time. Experimenting, kind of unsurprising as one. So first one we're going to talk about is the 5Es. And this representation I kind of like because it indicates that it's cyclic. If you write it out as a list, it seems linear. It seems like there's steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you're done. But in fact, it's cyclic in the sense that you can do steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then go back to step 1. But you can also go 1, 2, another shot at 2, 3, back to 2, 4, back to 3, and so on. So, or you can start at a step other than 1. You could start further along down the scheme. So the fact that it's cyclic, you can see there are forward arrows and there are smaller backward arrows, so you can go backward at various stages. I may have mentioned before, my colleague Harry Canassa, who I respect a lot and we work together and have done for a long time, likes to plan a whole 5Es sequence in one lesson plan. I think it's very hard to do justice to all of the 5Es in one lesson. I would prefer to use the 5Es across a week, a unit, some bigger thing, so that you spend maybe a whole lesson, maybe a couple of lessons on engaging the students, and then a couple of lessons maybe on exploring and so on. So that's a professional judgment difference that the two of us have. We both have PhDs in this field. We've both taught for a very long time. It's just there are different ways, different emphases, different approaches, and that's perfectly valid if you can make the argument for your particular approach. So let's kind of look at what these steps entail. So the engage phase, something that gets the students mentally engaged with the topic. So this is an inquiry learning sequence. This is not a telling them sequence. It's some kind of activity. So it might be something like watching a video, but hopefully something more active than that. Maybe it will be doing a demonstration. Maybe it will be doing an experiment. You're getting the question that forms the basis of the unit to be a live question, a question that the students care about. So the engage phase is getting the students engaged, getting them not just physically, but mentally engaged with the problem you're discussing. And I think I just saw some text go up that was black and didn't come up on the screen. There we go. Interesting. All right. So there's a number of things that you could do. A demo, some reading or watching a video, graphic organizer, free writing. So tell us what you know about that thing in whatever way you want to. Brainstorms, KWL. So what do you know? What do you want to know? And what have you learned? KWLH, I might talk about a little bit later. So all of these ways to get the students involved, engaged, connected with the information that they're working on. The explore phase gives the students actual time to do experiments with the concept. So you're helping them to start to really develop the concept by having a range of experience investigations. Remember, it's an inquiry sequence. So how are they inquiring into it? What experiences are they having that help them to work on it? So investigations, sources, problem solving, model making, etc. Oops. So there's a number of things going on there, obviously, where you are having the students actively involved with, investigating, exploring the topic and learning more about it. Now, the explain phase is interesting. Teachers often think that explain phase means, okay, this is where the teacher explains. But that's not the case. Now, I don't know whether I've already said it, but teacher explanations are a research area of mine. They're something I'm very interested in, and there's definitely a place for them. But at the explain phase of the 5 E's is really about the students explaining. So the students explain the ideas to the teacher, students explain the ideas to each other. Teacher helps them develop their explanations. So the teacher might model explanation, the teacher might scaffold the activities that make up a good explanation. But the explain phase is not, okay, kids, you've had your fun engaging and exploring, now I'm going to tell you the stuff. That's not how it works at all. It's about the students explaining the concepts to one another and to themselves in a way that makes it possible for them to understand. So clarified, modified, reflective, analysing explanations, peer marking, testing each other's explanations, what's your evidence for that claim, getting the students to test each other's claims and to challenge each other, questionings, discussions. Teacher explanation is part of it, as I said. Comparing and classifying, so some of the higher level Bloom's taxonomy things. I'm presuming that you've run into Bloom's taxonomy already in your studies. If you haven't, essentially the lower levels of thinking are the recall, remember the facts, remember the information, be able to apply it. The higher level are be able to make judgments, assess, evaluate, synthesize, pull together, compare and contrast, classify, etc. So what we're saying is, at this explain phase, you're elaborating their understanding. You're getting them to think about it more deeply and be able to explain it and clarify it for themselves more deeply than they have so far. The elaborate phase, once they've got an understanding, then they want to make it richer. The difference between a novice and an expert understanding is not that there's more knowledge, it's that the knowledge is more well elaborated. There's more detail, there's more sophistication and nuance and complexity. So elaborating their knowledge means adding extra detail, making it clearer and more precise. Expanding and solidifying student thinking, applying it in the real world. So application is also one of those higher level thinking skills. So activities might include things like problem solving and decision making. Do you make a judgment about which is the best plastic recycling scheme? Something like that, where you have to apply the knowledge that you've developed over the course of the unit to solve a real world problem. They can conduct an experiment. They can again be doing those compare and contrast, classify, apply, etc. activities. So again, it's time for them to really process it. And the other thing that's worth mentioning is that there's lots of research that shows that if they just hear it once, it just skims across the top of the brain. Just the sensory register, the immediate what's going into our head at the moment, but that as immediately is gone because the next thing comes across and replaces it. What we need to be doing is engaging with it deeply multiple times over more than one occasion, and that's how we actually retain it. So if you're getting them to, over the course of the unit, engage with the concept multiple times, multiple contexts, apply it to different things, think about it from different angles, then it's going to stay. It's going to become part of them and part of their thinking, rather than just being something that they study for the test and then forget about for the rest of their life. So evaluate phase, again, high order thinking skills. Actually not so much about the teacher assessing performance. It's about students assessing their own performance. It's about meta, what's the word? I've lost it for the moment. I won't go chasing it. Metacognition, thank you, there it is. Just takes the old brain a minute to float it up. Metacognition, so it's about them thinking about their thinking and learning about their learning. The teacher will have to make some sort of assessment, make some sort of judgment, because we're asked to come up with grades, and we're asked also to give students feedback about how they're going, how their understanding's developing, and so on. So the evaluate phase is really for the students to evaluate their own learning. And this is the KWLH. So a KWL chart is, what do you know already? So at the start of the unit, what do we already know? Let's summarize it on the wall. And then what do we want to know? What's interesting? If the engage phase worked, there'll be things that they're very interested to find out. So what do we want to know? Then at the end of the unit, or towards the end of the unit, L, what I've learned. So what have we learned since the beginning of the unit? Have we answered those questions under the W? Things that we wanted to know, do we know them yet? So you're evaluating that. And then the H is how I know. What's my evidence that I have learned that thing? So how do I know that that's actually true? So that's the kind of evaluation that's going on in the evaluate phase, is the students saying, I know that this is the case, and I'm confident because this is how I know. I have some evidence for the claim that I want to make. So, as I say, the evaluate phase is mainly about students evaluating, just like the explain phase is mainly about students explaining, but the teacher will do some explaining and the teacher will do some evaluation and assessment, some marking, some judging of the extent to which students have learned things. So scoring tools and rubrics, again, you can get them to peer assess. You can get them to do a performance assessment where they have to physically do something rather than write paper and pencil. There's a whole variety of different ways that you can assess, and that the assessment can be explicit to them. So again, a portfolio where they represent their own learning and make claims about their own learning and support it with evidence, and then you can look at it, but they have a sense of what they know and how they know it. So there are lots of different kinds of questions that are relevant in science education. Try and avoid saying, do you have any questions? That's usually fairly fruitless. And asking specific questions. So focusing their attention on a particular topic. What's going on? Can you see what's going on? What's happening there? How has that changed? What does that look like? Measuring and counting. So how many blue cars went past the school this morning versus how many yellow cars went past the school? Comparing similarities and differences. What if questions, essentially. What happens if we did that? What would be the result? So you're asking them to predict now. And problem solving. So challenging them to extend. And this is really kind of elaborate phase. This is getting them to go, all right, you know now that if your plant has light early on, it will grow better than if it doesn't have light early on. Could you design an experiment to make it do something different? So you're asking them to extend and elaborate the knowledge that they've already developed into a new topic. So that's the 5 E's. This is a second model, so it's a different model from the 5 E's. It has some similarities and some differences. So this is from a primary teaching book, so for those of you who have primary background, but it's also relevant to junior secondary and can be used. So exploratory stage. So in a way, it kind of combines the engage and explore from the 5 E's, but it's slightly different in focus. So establishing a puzzle or dilemma, seeking understanding, complications, demonstrating to them that they need the scientific explanation, challenging the misconceptions that they might have, the ideas that they have that are pre-scientific or just everyday ideas that don't fully explain their experience. So exploration stage, you're doing experiments. Again, it's not just sitting and watching a video. It's not just hearing from the teacher. It's doing something actively. Second stage is redescribing, getting the students to actually be able to explain their ideas in the light of the new scientific knowledge. So they had their pre-instruction concepts, their misconceptions, their preconceptions, their children's science, their prior conceptions. And then after the exploration phase, the exploratory phase, and after talking with the teacher and their peers, they describe the scientific concept, understand the scientific concept, and then start using it to find it fruitful, to find it interesting, and so on. So again, I'm going to hark back to the conceptual change. They have to be dissatisfied with the old approach, which is what the exploratory stage helps with. And then they have to find the scientific approach intelligible, plausible, and fruitful. And that's what this middle stage is about. It has to be intelligible, they have to understand it, it has to seem to make sense, it has to be plausible, and it has to seem fruitful. It has to explain more phenomena than they're used to being able to explain. And then finally, the third stage, application. So take that new knowledge that you've got and apply it to different contexts, different experiments, different situations. So you can see there's a lot of parallels between these different ideas. And again, between ideas like the conceptual change model as well. There's relationships to constructivism, where you talk about taking a schema and accommodation and assimilation and those kind of things. So these ideas are all in some way explaining humans and how they learn. So there are similarities, but there are differences in emphasis and approach. So some of them will be better for some teachers, some of them will be better for some students, some of them will be better for some topics and some contexts. So you're making a decision from among a range of options and possibilities for different reasons, for different powers. So, and finally, this is a model from my colleague Xin Fan, and I wrote a chapter where we proposed a new model, and then Xin later went back to Beijing and experimented on teachers and students. That's not a good way to phrase it. It conducted an experiment with teachers and students and found that this particular sequence led to significant conceptual learning on the part of students. So it's tried and tested. It had a very significant effect size, learning gain on the part of the students. And so we're trying to research it in more contexts and build it up and test it in a number of places. So it's something that I think is well worth you understanding and knowing about. And again, similarities and differences from the other approaches. So initially we were talking about interactive simulations, computer-based virtual laboratories, but it turns out that it works for basically every kind of teaching. So our zero step was to say, is an interactive simulation the right tool? So the more generalizable version of that is whatever you're trying to use, whatever experience, whatever thing that you want to do with the students, the right tool for the job. So pick the right tool for the job. And that's basically what we were saying, is what tool is, what instructional strategy, what technology, what learning experiences is the best one for the job. And then step one, elicitation and clarification of the existing conceptions and the target scientific conception. So in other words, you draw from the class what they believe already about this topic, and you also share with the class the scientific topic. Clearly, briefly, concisely, but so it's not just come in, sit down behind your desks, bam, I'm giving you the scientific concept. It's, this is the context, this is what we're talking about, maybe here's a demonstration, here are some things, give me your explanation, your explanation, your explanation. Let's talk, let's get all of the concepts we already have in the class out of it. And maybe someone in the class will already have the scientific conception and it'll come from them, or you'll say it as the teacher as well. So you'll end up having a number of different candidate ideas, different concepts that explain the world in slightly different ways will be kind of there in the discussion, and then you'll move forward with them. So step two, we're going to do this experiment. And what's the implication of your theory for the results of that experiment? If you're correct, if your existing concept is correct, then when we conduct the experiment, what will we observe? What will be the result that we see? What about yours? If we take yours, what will we expect to see? if we take the scientific concept in this experiment, what will we expect to see? What will be the result of that particular thing? Step 3, test the concept. So use an interactive simulation in this case we talked about, but use a real laboratory experiment as well, or use a demonstration or a number of other activities that allow you to test. And then because you've already clarified what the implications are of each idea, as soon as they see the experiment, they understand what it means. So hopefully in the experiment, all of the misconceptions, all the alternative conceptions that aren't scientific get the wrong prediction, and the scientific concept makes the right prediction. It's not always that simple, partly because experiments don't always work as planned in the classroom, and partly because there might be non-scientific concepts that nonetheless will correctly predict this experiment, so we need to do a different experiment to get rid of those. Because what you're trying to do in this, remember the open entry thing, you're trying to arrive at the scientific concept. You want all the students to adopt the scientific concept. So you're trying to effectively destroy all the non-scientific concepts with the experiment, but you're not doing it by your authority, just saying you're wrong, you're wrong. You're going, okay, the evidence shows that the scientific explanation explains everything correctly, and that these other candidate explanations don't explain everything correctly, don't explain our experience of the world correctly. Step 4, clarification of findings and linking to the scientific conception. So they will have seen it, they will know what it means, but they may still not have it explicit in their brain. So really nailing it down, saying, look, this conception, this conception, this conception were not supported by the evidence. This scientific conception was supported by the evidence. It's the one that works, is what you're doing at this step, making sure that they've got it. And then that elaborate phase, that taking it, applying it to new contexts, further testing, really testing the scientific concept to destruction to show that it works really powerfully across a number of contexts and so on. So as I say, this has been tested. It helped the students with their conceptual knowledge of the science that they were learning. It helped them with their confidence. They knew what they knew. They were confident that the answer they were giving was the correct answer. And it helped them with their science inquiry skills. It sounds almost quite teacher directed, but it's really kind of teacher scaffolded, and there's lots of time for student discussion among it, but it really helped them with their science inquiry skills. They were better able to inquire into a new question and use it. They were scaffolded up in that as well. So quite an effective sequence. So that's a really short rundown of 3 instructional sequences, instructional strategies, instructional models. And as I say, there are similarities and differences. There are ways in which they support each other and ways in which they challenge each other, slightly different emphases. But it's useful to know about all of them. So I'm actually going to skip that step. Well, we said that already, right? We said that right at the start with the flower petal diagram of the 5 E's. They are not necessarily linear models. And so this model has linearly ordered steps, but you needn't do them in that order. It's dynamic as well. You can change the order around, you can repeat steps, you can skip steps, etc. These are professional judgments that you'll make yourself. Okay, thanks very much. Enjoy. See you in the lab.